What's going on? I'm Arch Manning, Viore athlete and college quarterback. Whether I'm running, training, traveling, or just unwinding at home, I love doing it in my core shorts from Viore. With a breathable boxer brief liner, they're quick to dry, super versatile, and stand up to even my most intense training sessions. Plus, they come in 3 inseams and a ton of colors. Ready to try a pair? Go to viore.com/arch and get 20% off at checkout. I think you're going to love them as much as I do. That's viore.com/arch and get 20% off your first order. Exclusions apply. Visit the website for full terms and conditions. Not only will you receive 20% off your first purchase, but enjoy free shipping on any U.S. orders over $75 and free returns. Have a great day.
I turned off news altogether.
I hate to say it, but I don't trust much of anything.
It's the rage bait.
It feels like it's trying to divide people.
If we got clear facts, maybe we can calm down a little.
NBC News brings you clear reporting. Let's meet at the facts. Let's move forward from there. NBC News, reporting for America.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 47 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. In 1783, the United States secured its independence from Great Britain. By 1810, many Americans began to look at the world around them and think about their place within it. Where did early Americans fit within the world around them? Today, we explore the answer to that question and the world of early American foreign missionaries with Emily Conroy Krutz, author of Christian Imperialism, Converting the World in the Early American Republic. During our exploration, Emily reveals information about Christian imperialism, a concept that can help us better understand how some early Americans viewed the world and Americans' place within it. Details about American missionaries. Who served? Where did they serve? And what goals did they have for the different peoples they ministered to? And how early American missionaries went about their work of converting the world between 1810 and 1847. Before we get to our conversation with Emily, I would like to ask for your help. This week, everyone who's subscribed to the Franklin Gazette will be receiving a survey in their inbox. This survey is mostly multiple choice, and it is about me trying to get to know you better. Plus, the information you provide will be of invaluable assistance as I apply for grants to help support this show. I know you're busy. I know this is a huge ask. So as a reward, everyone who answers the survey and supplies their email address at the end will be eligible to win a signed copy of John Ferling's Whirlwind, The American Revolution and the War That Won It. I had the opportunity to meet John in person, and I brought 2 copies of the book, which he signed, and now I'd like to give 2 copies of Whirlwind away. So please, take a few moments, help me with my survey, and enter this contest to win a signed copy of Whirlwind. Okay, without further ado, let's meet Emily Conroy Krutz.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest today is an assistant professor of history at Michigan State University. She is a specialist in international American reform and religious history. She is the author of 4 articles and a brand new book, Christian Imperialism, Converting the World in the Early American Republic. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Emily Conroy Krutz.
Hi, Liz. Thanks for having me.
Emily, I'm really glad you could be here because this is like a special day for us. We weren't exactly classmates, but what were we? Seminar buddies?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, seminar buddies. And we got to workshop chapters of each other's projects when they were but dissertations, and now your dissertation is a book.
Yeah, I know. It's been a long time. Exciting to have you read it now.
Well, it's a fantastic read, and today we are going to discuss your new book and the ideas it contains. I think we should begin our discussion with what Christian imperialism is. Christian imperialism serves not just as the title of Emily's book, but as her book's central idea. Emily, would you tell us what you mean by Christian imperialism?
Absolutely. Yeah. So this is a term that I came up with to try to think about what it is that the foreign missionary movement is trying to do and how we might understand their work. When they were describing their work, they would describe themselves as going about converting the world, which is my subtitle. But for us today in the 21st century, the imperialism and empire questions of their project really stand out. And so I wanted to think about that and try to get at how this is a story that is really interesting for religious historians, but also incredibly interesting and important for those who are interested in American politics and America's role in the world at large. What looking at the foreign mission movement does is really gives us a moment of seeing a debate and a contest over what this new country is going to be like on the world stage. And the missionaries have a particular vision that I call Christian imperialism that they are putting out in conversation with other groups of Americans at this time about what the role of the U.S. in the world should be. So I'm talking about imperialism because they are operating in a world largely defined by empires, and that is absolutely important about determining where they go and how they get involved in missions in the first place. So the British Empire in particular looms very large, and there's a lot of Anglo-American cooperation going on. But they also, as they're getting involved in these places and actually going to these places, having a really interesting critique of empire as they see it and putting forward a vision and an imagination of what empire could be if it is enacted in the way that they see as the best and ideal way. So that's where the sort of Christian adjective comes in, that they understand that nations they consider Christian nations, which would be the U.S., have a duty to go out in the world and not only have commercial networks and political networks and things like this, but much more importantly, have a moral duty and a religious duty to spread Christianity and civilization along with it. So that's sort of what I'm getting at with the term, and the book is tracing how that vision plays out in real life when some missionaries actually get to some of these different places.
It's fascinating that not 20 years after independence, Americans are thinking about imperialism and their place within the world and how they want to influence the world. Your book covers some early American Christians and how religion drove them to try and civilize countries and other lands by bringing Christianity, or should I say mostly American Protestantism, to those places. Do you know if other Americans who were not religiously motivated were also thinking about imperialism, or is this imperialism distinct to early American Christians?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, you've got a lot of Americans all over the world, so certainly engaged in other places. So commercial networks, for example, merchants are all over the place. You've got Americans trading in Asia almost as soon as they can after independence. And those are some of the people that the missionaries are getting into contact with for sure. So you've got commercial networks, you've got the beginnings of political networks as you have consuls beginning to be set up in some places around the world. The extent to which empire and imperialism is the language that they're using, what they're thinking about, it sort of depends on who you're talking to and how they are connecting to other empires. I think you do have a certain extent of a emulation of the British imperial model, and certainly the desire to have some kind of commercial connections around the world. The U.S. at this point does not have the political power on the world stage at all to really be able to envision having an empire on the scale of any of these other countries that we think about more easily as empires in this period, which is part of why I found the sort of missionaries playing with the ideas of empire so interesting, because, why would you see this early? This is not at all, 1812 when they first leave for India, this is not a moment of particular strength for the U.S. on the world stage by any means. And so this entry does seem really interesting, and it shows us, I think, some of these intriguing overseas ideas about empire. Now, at the same time, if we're thinking about empire, we need to remember it's not just an overseas concept. On the continent itself, you have all kinds of Americans being involved in what we can see as colonial practices on the continent. So, right, if manifest destiny and expansion, all of these things, that's a form of colonialism and American empire that is absolutely happening in the early 19th century as well. I mean, particularly in engagements with Native Americans. And so those are a lot of the people that I was sort of talking about. The missionaries are part of a conversation about what the U.S. is going to be like in terms of these questions of empires and colonies. and things like this.
Now that we've talked about early American imperialism broadly, let's talk more specifically about the case studies in your book. In Christian Imperialism, Emily charts American engagement in the world prior to the Mexican-American War in 1847. Emily, who served as missionaries? Can you give us a behind-the-scenes look at the types of people who went on these early American missions and who decided which missionaries would serve and where?
So I'm looking mostly at the missionaries who served through the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, which is an incredibly long name, but I'll refer to them as the American Board or the ABCFM as we go on. And so ABCFM missionaries, if you're going to be a full ordained missionary at this point, early in the 19th century, that means that you are going to be a man and you are going to be a pretty well-educated man. You're going to have gone to college in order to be an ordained missionary or to be an ordained minister in the denominations that these folks are coming from, the Presbyterians, the Congregationalists mostly. And so we're talking mostly Northeasterners, we're talking mostly well-educated, middle-class type folks. But you also have, serving at these missions, assistant missionaries who might be men with less educational backgrounds. So depending on where you're talking about, these might be folks who are trained to be printers or teachers. And you also have women. Women are serving as assistant missionaries, as teachers in some of the stations. If they're unmarried, that's mostly going to be in North America or Hawaii in this period. You see a couple will pop up in other places, but the large proportion of the women who are serving are married to male missionaries. So you have these missionary wives all over the place who have a very similar background to their husbands, right? So these are educated women for the most part, middle class, mostly Northeasterners, very sort of pious, well-educated women who most of whom have a background in teaching for some time before they become missionary wives. And the way that these folks, if you want to become a missionary, what do? You will reach out to the American Board and sort of put yourself up as a candidate. And so there are fantastic files of these candidates' records in the ABCFM papers at Houghton Library. And you can see folks writing in, and when you read enough of them, they all sound quite similar. There's sort of a form that you take, and you'll write in and say that you have a calling to serve the heathen, which is the language that they are using to describe basically almost all non-Christians around the world. And some people will say specifically that they want to serve the heathen in Africa or Asia or in North America, but many people won't specify where they want to go at all. It'll be sort of a general interest, but that they feel called to go out and serve, and they might describe their religious background and sort of start the process of sort of inquiring about what this job might entail and what it would be to be chosen. And the ABCFM writes back usually and asks for, if you're going to become particularly an ordained full missionary, some kind of an essay on more specifics on your religious beliefs, on how would you tell if someone had really been converted, what would you do, and things like this. The interesting things for me, too, are letters from women who are writing in and asking to become missionaries. Often women would have their ministers write for them before they would reach out themselves. And so you get some really interesting dynamics there. And some of these assistant missionaries, too, particularly for places like the Cherokee Nation, where you have large numbers of people coming, you will get sort of several families from one community will all agree to go together. And so you'll see this little cluster of letters from one town where a bunch of people will say, we know you're starting a mission station at such and such place, and here's a group of pious farmers and their families, and you'll get these little sort of short biographical details of 10, 15 people who all want to go and spread the word of the gospel.
Speaking of specific biographical details, do you think you could give us an image of one particular missionary who wrote in and their reasons for going on their mission?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess a good place to start might be some of the first couples. So Adoniram Judson and his wife Anne become quite famous and celebrated. The early missionaries, they become Baptists, so they're well known actually to this day among Baptist circles. So the Judsons, he becomes very interested in missions as a student. He's reading books about India in particular, books about India that talk about the religious state of the subcontinent and how there's now this opportunity to go out and spread religion. The field is white for the harvest is the language that you see circling around all the time in these letters. And so he and a group of other students come together and decide that they want to go and become missionaries. And so he writes, sort of beautiful, inspired texts about how, he feels really compelled that this is the time that Americans now need to go out, and he personally needs to go out and try to convert the world. The time is now, and he is ready. And so he is one of the first to ask for the formation of the American Board, actually, and at the same time applies to become a missionary to the London Missionary Society. So we see him writing actually to multiple audiences about his sense of the urgency of going and becoming a missionary. And he does see it as this very personal call, that there are people around the world who, if they don't have access to the Word of God, he believes that they will, suffer eternal damnation after their death. And so it is his duty, since he can physically get himself to India, to go and try to spread the word to them. So that's sort of how he gets there, is through reading these texts about India and going forward. He meets his wife, Ann Judson, after having had that experience. And so Ann Judson is a teacher, and she is living in Massachusetts, and pious woman, sort of interested in missions generally. And when she meets her soon-to-be husband and they decide to get married and to go forward together, that is absolutely the understanding of their marriage from the beginning, right? This is not a marriage that is, they meet and they fall in love and they decide to get married and they happen to decide to become missionaries. This is, they both feel this calling and get married so that they can both go forward and do their work in the best way possible. So that's how she comes to go as well, is through the sense of calling, and then through meeting a male missionary who is looking for a wife. And her good friend Harriet Newell, then hearing about Anne's engagement to a missionary and leaving for India, Harriet becomes inspired based on that experience. And so that's when Harriet decides to marry Samuel Newell, another one of the early missionaries, and they are all going to go out to India together. So it's a lot of reading is really important. Reading these texts that are coming from other parts of the world that are talking about the possibilities of missions, particularly coming from British writers in the very early years. As time goes on, writing from Americans is going to become incredibly important for later generations as well. But it's sort of reading these texts about the rest of the world, getting excited about what the possibilities are, and along with that, having a very strong sense of conviction about the urgency of evangelizing around the world for the salvation of all of these souls.
So it sounds like Judson became interested in India because he reads texts about British missionaries' experiences over there, and he wants to participate in their efforts. And from the story of the Judsons, it also sounds like that missionaries often encouraged friends and family members to become missionaries.
Oh, yeah.
Let's follow the Judsons for a few more moments. The first American missionaries went to India. What did missionaries like the Judsons hope to accomplish there, and how did they go about their work in converting Indians to American Protestantism?
Yeah, so this group is wonderful, and this is how I got into this project. So if you follow the Judsons and the Newells and the Knotts and Gordon Hall and Luther Rice to India from the U.S., they leave in 1812, and so they get to India actually during the War of 1812. So they have a bit of an interesting start. Not what they expected. They are actually arrested when they get to India, and at some points they are sort of seen as potential spies from the U.S. during the War of 1812. So it's an interesting start, and why they choose India does raise some interesting questions. So they were hoping to get to Burma, and based on some of these texts that they are reading coming out of England that talk about the different places in Asia and try to give them some information. So they're, reading these books when they're sitting in Salem. They are writing back and forth with people in England. They are talking to as many American merchants as they can, trying to decide where they're going to go. For the best knowledge that they have about these places, they think Burma is going to be a great place to go. It's close to the British Empire, but it's not actually in the British Empire, so they're hoping they'll be able to sort of benefit from the passage of English ships and sort of proximity to the civilization, as they see it, of the British, without necessarily being under the thumb of British officials. But when they get to India and are getting ready to move to the next stop to get to Burma, they find out new information about the Burmese government that they didn't have access to in the U.S. And so they decide that actually the government there is too tyrannical. They can't possibly survive there as missionaries. So they want to stay in India, which raises some major questions for the East India Company government, which is in control in India. And so there's a number of years of sort of back and forth and tension about whether or not the U.S. missionaries are actually going to be allowed to stay there. So it takes a while. They leave in 1812. The mission doesn't start its operations until 1815. And at that point, what they start doing is what they're going to do more or less at every mission that the ABCFM will set up around the world. They start out by opening schools. Education is incredibly important to the mission project. They also begin learning the language because the missionaries have not actually had the foreign language training before they left the U.S. So they're coming into India with no vernacular languages at all. So they have to do that training once they get there. And as they're learning the languages, they begin to translate the Bible and other religious tracts and texts that they can distribute to other people. So the main sort of pillars of their methods are teaching, translation, and printing, and then preaching, of course, which they begin doing sort of, again, as they're learning the language. And so the schools will become sort of the major engine of their work to the best of their ability.
When I read Christian Imperialism, I was taken with the story of Babaji and his wife Audi. I wonder if you would tell us their story and what the process of conversion to American Protestantism was like for potential converts.
Babaji and his wife Audi are one of my favorite finds as we were doing this. So he is one of the early converts in the Bombay mission and sort of stands out because there are so few converts that actually end up being baptized in India by the Americans in this period. So he's baptized in 1831 after spending about 8 years working with the missionaries as a teacher, largely working with the missionaries on their language skills. And his story of how he gets to become a convert and also his relationship with the mission sort of throughout this period really speaks to some of the difficulties that converts could face and some of the very high expectations that the missionaries have of what it's going to take to sort of convince them that you're really a Christian and to get them to baptize you. And I think that says a lot about their expectations of the combinations of religion and culture and civilization. So to sort of get more specifically at what I mean by that, he is a Brahmin Hindu, so high caste, very well educated, and has been very important to the mission for a long time. As I said, I think they've known him for 8 years when he requests baptism. And in the missionary writings about that request, they are all sort of taken aback by how rapid a change they've seen. All of a sudden, he has become incredibly pious. All of a sudden, he wants to convert. All of a sudden, he wants to be baptized. And they're really shocked by this and, of course, delighted, shocked and delighted. There's one problem when he comes to them is that he has been, for several years, living with a woman as his wife, someone named Audi. Audi had been widowed when she was very young, and so she was not supposed to remarry. And yet had a relationship with Babaji, and they were living together for a very long time as a married couple, more or less. And this creates a real problem for the mission, right, is marriage is not recognized. And so can they continue to live together unless they are sort of married in a solemn ceremony? And the missionaries say no, they have to actually be married if they're going to live together and sleep together. And so they do that, actually. Babaji and Audi are married at the mission by the missionaries, and he becomes a Christian, and at this time she does not. But they both end up working with the mission and living with the missionaries for a number of years. They move to a new missionary station that's being built. Babaji at first becomes an incredibly important figure in the formation of that church. He's one of the early elders there. He assists the missionary on itinerant preaching pretty frequently and will preach himself as well. Audi will eventually convert after the death of one of these missionaries, where sort of sitting by the bedside, and we don't have her description of this, we have the missionary's description of this, right? But they will tell us that the experience of watching a good Christian death has led her to be converted, and so that's when she requests baptism herself. Babaji will die pretty young, and she remarries another missionary assistant from India, and they get married again at the mission. And this wedding is a bit more celebrated by the missionaries because this is going to be a way of sort of showing everyone in India, all these Hindus can look at this Christian marriage and see what marriage should look like, what a wedding should look like. It doesn't have the pageantry of the Hindu wedding. It is much more quiet and modest and somber and solemn, and that for the missionaries is a really big deal, that they're able to sort of show people what a Christian marriage looks like, and that it's not just watching these white American missionaries, but now you have this Christian Indian couple that people can watch and sort of see an example of what it might look like if they became Christians. Because this has been, the trouble for the missionaries for a long time, because people, particularly high caste people like Babaji, have been pretty reluctant to convert because it would mean giving up things like their caste status, and the American missionaries are pretty strict on this, that to become a Christian would mean, having the Lord's Supper at a table with, whoever else is part of the church community, so whoever else is a member, so regardless of their caste. So you'd be breaking caste by taking part in communion, potentially. You would have to be willing to give that up to become a Christian. Other missionaries, British missionaries, are much more willing to sort of find workarounds for that and to allow people who want to become baptized but don't necessarily want to give up all of their cultural traditions to sort of find ways to make that work. And the Americans are pretty strict at this point about, becoming a Christian does not just mean, saying that you believe in the gospel. It means also behaving in particular ways and modeling Anglo-American culture in particular ways. And so Babaji and Audi become these really important figures for sort of showing that can happen even when it hasn't been expected, which is great. And so it's why he gets, after his death, is celebrated in the American press and has a 2-volume memorial published in the U.S. It's not one of the bestseller memoir text, but it is a substantial text that sort of uses this couple as a way of talking about India in particular and the possibilities there.
It sounds like the Americans were uncompromising, and I am curious as to why they were uncompromising and the British missionaries were willing to compromise. I would also like you to discuss what it really meant for someone like Babaji to convert. You mentioned that he'd have to renounce his caste, but it also sounds like he faced social ostracism from his former friends and community members.
Yeah, and that's really real. So sort of to answer that question about what you're giving up, there's sort of social ostracism. Some people talk about sort of economic barriers as well. There's one person who has requested baptism and then ultimately doesn't go through with it because they're pretty sure that economically they're not going to receive an inheritance if they convert. And then, of course, there are stories of physical violence against converts, particularly those who go out and take part in evangelization, which is the expectation, particularly in these India missions where you don't have that many converts. The hope is that those who do convert would become then assistants to the mission and go out and evangelize themselves and try to spread the word, and that could be quite dangerous. Babaji, in those memoirs, we have some translations of his writings and his preachings. And so he himself has very high expectations of the other Indian members of his church, that they will go out and sort of face that violence and still spread the word. So it's sort of interesting seeing his language and how he preaches and comparing that with what the missionaries are saying and sort of seeing some of the overlaps there. But yeah, sort of to the question of the sort of Americans versus the British on how compromising they're being to an accommodating of sort of cultural differences. I think part of the difference at this point, this is the British Empire that the Americans are working in. So the British colonial figures are very concerned about stability. Missionaries make them very nervous because, go figure, people don't like it when you come and tell them that their religion is wrong and that their culture is wrong and that you should change, right? So missionaries can be really destabilizing in these places. And so the East India Company is very nervous about the presence of missionaries, particularly missionaries that aren't, Standard Church of England folks. So the British missionaries work a little bit more closely with the East India Company at certain points. You also have, very different understandings of class in the U.S. and England, right? So there's that as well. But the Americans are coming into this space as outsiders in a lot of ways. And so this is one of the places where you can see them being quite critical of what they see in an empire. They are unbelievably critical of caste. They see it as the number one barrier of conversion in India and really think that the British missionaries and the British government should be much more active in getting rid of it. Whereas for the British Empire, caste is a system that you can work with and that can sort of help lead to stabilization. So this is one of these points where you see a lot of conflict between the Americans and the British and a lot of the criticism of, as the Americans are sort of looking at other forms of empire. So, when we talk about their Christian imperialism as a sort of vision of a model of what empire should look like, this is one of the points where they can point and say, if you were being imperial in a Christian manner, you would not be allowing for this system to continue, and yet look at how this is. And so the result is, of course, that the missionaries don't actually convert that many people, but they're very hopeful. They use a seed metaphor frequently, that they're planting seeds that will one day bear fruit by spreading texts, by itinerating, and by converting these very few, that one day they hope they'll make a big difference.
In fact, India is merely the first place that the American missionaries plant seeds. In Christian Imperialism, Emily discusses many missions that early American missionaries established. Emily, would you tell us about some of the different missions that early American missionaries created, and whether their conversion techniques were based on the population they ministered to, or whether they followed a standard set of techniques that all the different early American missions used?
By the 1840s, by the end of this book, there are American missionaries pretty much everywhere around the world. Pretty much every continent has got some missionaries. I mean, not a ton, but they've got a presence all over the place. And so there are a lot of different places that they're going, and slightly different methods depending on where they are. Generally speaking, those three pillars of methods that I mentioned in India are going to be carried on everywhere else, right? So teaching is huge everywhere. Translation and printing of the Bible is huge everywhere. And preaching, of course, is big everywhere. But how that gets worked out is very dependent on where specifically they are. And this is, again, some of the ways that we see their vision sort of meeting reality. And it's often political realities that are going to shape what they're going to do. So schools, for example, vary tremendously depending on where they are in this period. So, in India, you've got a lot of local schools that are taught by native Indian staff, because there aren't that many American personnel there to run that many schools. They're educating thousands of children, but mostly the teachers are going to be certainly non-Christians. And they've got Indian Brahmins and Indian Jews teaching these schools, and so you see lots of fights about sort of classroom management and that sort of thing. In India, that contrasts very much to what's happening, for example, in the Cherokee schools or the Hawaiian schools, in both of which places you see very large staffs of Americans who are working with the mission and are able to create much more large-scale schools. So in the Cherokee Nation, for example, you are going to have major agricultural schools where the idea is that really much more sort of heavy-handed than you see anywhere else, civilization is going to be key. And at all these missions, at this point, it's understood that civilization and Christianity go hand in hand and that you can't have the one without the other. And this is, one of the major barriers to conversion in various places. So in the Cherokee Nation, you have missionaries going in and teaching farming. And so this is why you have all these farmers who are coming down that I mentioned earlier, who are taking part in these educational projects. You have boys and girls being taught in very different ways to sort of raise them up to white American gender norms and behaviors, and just huge numbers of staff. And so large schools that are taking up large amounts of land, lots of students, lots of teachers sort of scattered around. In Hawaii, you also have astronomical numbers of students being educated in the mission schools. And in both of these places, in Hawaii and the Cherokee Nation, the reason that that's possible is not only because the schools are sort of generally the most attractive parts of what the missions are offering. Parents like having educational opportunities for their children, but also you have governments participating in this. So in the Cherokee Nation, you have the missionaries arriving at a time in the 18-teens when within the Cherokee Nation you have some major changes going on and a major political move to try and make it sort of clear to the U.S. government that the Cherokee are civilized. And so an embrace of this kind of education, because it really provides an opportunity for the Cherokee to potentially defend their sovereignty. That goes alongside the U.S. federal government's interest in expanding civilization in the Cherokee Nation. And so the U.S. government actually funds a lot of those schools that the ABCFM is running for the Cherokee out of what is called the Civilization Fund in the U.S. budget. And so there you have sort of this, on both sides, this sort of multiple governments and political bodies interested in sort of having the missionaries there. And so they're able to do a lot That, of course, will collapse with Indian removal and the rise of Andrew Jackson. In Hawaii, the possibility is there because the missionaries arrive at a transition in the Hawaiian government and are able to really take advantage of that and work with a Hawaiian government that's, again, very interested in making visible its civilization and its sort of status to multiple European and American powers. And so having this Western education becomes quite valuable for them as well. So you have much larger scale schools. Many more missionaries are able to be sent to both of those places than you see certainly in the Asian missions and Africa than the Middle East. But you have missions in all of those places in the Middle East and Africa as well. And schools are really the priority everywhere, and particularly girls' schools, which are seen as a major way of changing these cultures and bringing about Christianity there.
It sounds like culture is a major component of Christian imperialism. It's not just religion that Americans want to spread, but they clearly see their place in the world as a people with a great culture that they want to share. Farming techniques in Cherokee country, religion in India, or American gender norms throughout the world. Is this a correct perception of Christian imperialism?
Yeah, culture is key. And so this word civilization I've been using is certainly a tricky word, and it's one that they are using at the time to talk about this. And this is a huge debate within the mission movement. It was in the 19th century, in the 20th century, and still today. How does religion fit in with culture? How much of sort of religious practice can you sort of separate from culture? For these missionaries in the early 19th century, culture and what they see as civilization is a huge part of Christianity. And it gets hard when you're talking about conversion, right? Because what they're talking about is an internal change. And what they want to be making is this sort of change of the heart. But how can you measure that? How can you tell if someone has converted, if someone now believes? They're looking at external signs, and those external signs are incredibly important for trying to measure what's happening. So gender norms, for example, unbelievably important. Monogamy, incredibly important. So they will, criticize polygamous relationships wherever they see them. They assume that they're everywhere. They talk a lot about how women in Christian nations have an elevated status, which always makes my women's history students kind of chuckle when I talk about this for the early 19th century, right? Because we know the limitations to women's rights in America at this time. And yet, what they're talking about is, the value that Americans are starting to have at this point for women's education. That women are understood as having some important place in society. And when they're writing about other places in the world, and not always in the most informed ways, but when they're writing about other places in the world, Americans assume that elsewhere women are cloistered, that elsewhere women are essentially the slaves of their husbands, that Christianity is going to mean women's emancipation. And Christianity is going to mean some kind of equality for women and an advancement and an elevation for women. And they're very clear that this is one of the reasons why you want to spread Christianity, is that it's going to help women. So women's schools are really prioritized in many places. And it's interesting to see, considering what we know about the reality of women's situation and status in the United States at this time, that this is so central to how they understand themselves in comparison with the rest of the world. But it is very key, and they see those gender relations as part and parcel of what they are talking about religiously, as well as a defining feature of their culture. And it's hard to separate those. And gender is just one example, right? So agricultural practices in Turkey, incredibly important. That is an important way of sort of being able to show your civilized status, and that becomes an important part of your, side by side with your religious education as well. And at this point in time, they see that as the ultimate good, bringing the two together. That what they do in the Cherokee is, before removal, is really what they'd like to be doing everywhere, I think. Being able to sort of have that civilization training alongside that religious training. They're very much questioning, does civilization come first? Does religion come first? How does, do you convert and then become civilized, or do you get civilized and then, you can become converted? It's a real chicken and egg question at this point, and continues to be for a while. But during this era, when the Christian imperialism mentality reigns, they are really sort of embracing the idea that they go together.
Before we move into the time warp, I have one last question. Emily, you charted American foreign missionary work between 1810 and 1847. Did American conceptions of the world and their place within it change at all within those 37 years of missionary work?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And yeah, they do. So the missionaries that I'm talking about, you have a major shift where you go from 1810 having zero international presence to by 1848 having missionaries on all continents. That's going to be a major difference in terms of the American imagination of where they belong in the world. So if in 1810 you have people like Adoniram Judson reading the writings of British missionaries as they try to imagine what the rest of the world looks like, by 1848 you have young evangelicals of both genders actually reading Harriet Newell's memoirs and the writings of other Americans who are all over the world and writing back now as experts for American audiences about what the rest of the world is. So now you have this sort of visible American presence all over the place. And that's really important. Outside of the missionary circle itself, though, you do have this contest over, what is the role of the U.S. in the world going to be. It is entering a new stage by the late 1840s. You have the Mexican War, in this point, making a major transition. So if in 1810 Christian imperialism is, a sort of viable argument for what the role of the U.S. should be, that it should be a moral presence on the world stage, that it should sort of be the partner of the British Empire in some ways, that idea is going to have really collapsed by the late 1840s, and the foreign mission movement is going to go through major transition in its thinking. But other Americans are going to be much more sort of the winners of that debate of sort of what the role of the U.S. in the world should be. So Manifest Destiny, is the winner. If you think about those as two sort of alternate visions for how the U.S. should be expanding and what the sort of imperial ideas of the U.S. should be in the early 19th century, Christian imperialism is not the winner. The continental, very aggressive and more military expansion across the continent of Manifest Destiny is by 1848. Obviously going to be the winning model for how America should be a colonial nation. The colonization movement by this point is going to have gone through also major transitions, which are incredibly central to the missionary story as well, because the missionaries are there in Liberia. But see, if you go from sort of this vision of removing free African Americans to Liberia as, a viable and potentially moral choice, which the missionaries and many of the colonization supporters would see, right? That colonization could be a way of converting Africa as well as resolving the question of multiracial America. By the 1840s, you have some, very different understandings of that, particularly after the rise of the abolitionist movement in the U.S., of the appropriateness of colonization. And so you have some very different ideas about the U.S. and the world. Some of the possibilities in the debate that you saw in the 1810s, those are starting to recede. So I talk about some of that transition largely when I talk about Singapore in the book, where by the late 1830s you have a couple of missionaries in Singapore, and they propose what they call a Christian colony to be established there. And this gets quashed almost immediately as soon as the request goes through to the U.S., and, that makes sense, right? Americans aren't establishing colonies in Asia in the 1830s. And yet what's really interesting about this proposal is that what they mean by a colony, and if you read their letters, or if you read the book when I talk about this, what they're describing is basically what they do in the Cherokee Mission. And they're now naming that as a colony and wanting to set it up, in Asia instead of in North America. And that makes it an impossibility for Americans to do in the late 1830s. And I think that shift in the language and in sort of the sense of what it is that Americans, can appropriately be doing in Asia in the 1830s is one of the major transitions that you see in this period.
Let's move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
Throughout Christian imperialism, Emily stresses how British missionaries served as a model for American missionaries and their work. So, Emily, we have to know, what happens when you remove the British missionaries from the picture? In your opinion, what might have happened if Great Britain hadn't had missionaries? How would the work of early American missionaries abroad have been different? And how would the lack of a British example have changed the way early Americans looked at the world and their place within it?
Well, that's a huge question. Yeah. And that's a really fun thing to think about. I think, there's probably two possibilities. On the one hand, if the British weren't there as a motivation and sort of as a pull factor to get the Americans to India, right? Because the British are being very successful, apparently, in India, and the Americans sort of want to take part in that. Maybe you wouldn't have seen the foreign interest at this point. Maybe you would have seen Americans continuing to emphasize North American missions and continue to be kind of frustrated with that, which, frankly, would be sort of interesting to see how that would have turned out, because the foreign mission movement, is a really important and sort of exciting part of this network of reform movements that are going on at this time. Because it's, foreign and overseas, you get a lot of excitement about the sort of exotic nature of some of it. So, who knows what kinds of effects that could have had on domestic missions and other things like that. What would have been, another possibility that would be really interesting is that you might have actually seen a more nationalistic version of this religious response to the world emerge. Because you do see, with the War of 1812 era, you see a little bit of, fundraising writing that talks about how the Americans are perhaps better position than the British, because the British are being distracted by these wars with Napoleon. And so maybe the Americans, that the Americans are being called to come out on the world stage and sort of, take the place of Britain and really emerge as the inheritors of that role as sort of moral evangelists on the world stage. So I guess it's potential that you could have a sort of much more nationalistic version of an American mission movement coming out at that point that wouldn't have been sort of colored by the Anglo-American cooperation that you have in its actual form. Just kind of interesting to think about. So I don't know.
It's really interesting because at a time when many Americans are looking away from Great Britain, they don't want to follow a British example. These Christians are looking towards Great Britain. So now that book number 1 is finished, what do you have planned for book number 2?
I'm doing a couple of different things right now, sort of trying to figure out where to go next. One thing I'm working on is an article about one of these missionary couples that is there in India, and the story fell out of the book. The Knotts, and looking at Roxana Knott in particular. Ann Judson and Harriet Newell become quite famous. Roxana Knott becomes sort of a forgotten figure, and so she has an interesting story that I'm sort of looking at and thinking about marriage in particular in the early 19th century. But hoping to do the next book project looking at some of the women's history that actually got me initially interested in this, and thinking about international reform and women's relationship to transatlantic reform in the years before 1840. So I'm starting to play around with that a little bit, and it's sort of at the exciting point when you have many, many more questions than you have answers. So it's been a lot of fun.
I'm not sure I'm ever going to exit that phase. I'm always going to have questions.
It's a good place to be. Yeah.
Where is the best place to look for more information about you, your work, and how we can reach you if we have more questions about Christian imperialism?
Well, I do have a website, which is emilyconroykrutz.com, and you can also find me at the Michigan State History Department's website. Just search for my name there. And I am on Twitter a little bit, so I am eConroyKrutz on Twitter. Would love to see you all there.
Emily, thank you for providing insight into how early Americans thought about themselves during the early republic and about how they viewed their place in the world.
Thanks so much for having me. It was fun.
Between 1810 and 1847, many early Americans saw their role in the world as religious and cultural messengers. They believed that they had a mission to convert the world to American Protestantism and to help bring American culture to peoples without civilization. As Emily revealed, many peoples throughout the world did not necessarily agree with the early Americans who visited them and tried to convert them to American religious and cultural ways. In fact, as Emily stated, the first American missionaries did not convert that many people. You can find more information about Emily, her book, Christian Imperialism, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page for this episode, benfranklinsworld.com/047. Do you like free books? If you do, you should sign up for Poor Richard's Club, because I have books that publishers have either sent extra copies of or books that they would like me to consider for the show that I simply cannot keep. I want to give them away, and I periodically do in Poor Richard's Club. You can join Poor Richard's Club by texting BFWorld to 33444 and using the link sent in the confirmation email to join the club. Or you can visit benfranklinsworld.com, sign up for the Franklin Gazette, and again, click the link sent in the confirmation email. What do you think about the idea of Christian imperialism? Does it help you better understand how some early Americans saw the world and their place within it? Email your answer to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or leave a comment on the show notes page for this episode or in Poor Richard's Club.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.